You've heard the stories, the dark corners of history where things happen that feel like they belong in a horror movie, not a textbook. We're told about grand plantations, southern hospitality, a world of elegance and grace. But there are other stories, the ones whispered in the dark. Stories about places where the mask of civility slips. We are going to a plantation in Louisiana in the year 1844, a place where the owner believed in something she called divine punishment, a place where, the legend says, orphans were fed to pigs. What's the truth behind this chilling tale? Where does the legend come from? And what happens when you dig into the real, documented history? You find something worse. The real story doesn't need monsters. It just needs a mirror. The true, documented horror doesn't start in 1844, but 10 years earlier. Not on a rural plantation, but in the heart of a bustling city. It doesn't start with orphans, but with enslaved people. And it wasn't discovered because of pigs, but because of a fire. If you value documented history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from contemporary newspapers like the New Orleans Bee and the official city court archives. Now back to the story. Our story begins in New Orleans, the French Quarter, a city of music, trade, and secrets. Here, at 1140 Royal Street, stood a grand three-story mansion. It was beautiful, balconies of intricate ironwork, a walled courtyard. Inside, mahogany furniture, crystal chandeliers, silk curtains. This was the home of Madame Marie Delphine McCarty, better known as Delphine Lalaurie. She was one of the most prominent women in the city, born around 1787 into a wealthy and powerful Creole family. Her cousin was the mayor. Her uncle was the governor of Spanish Louisiana. She was connected, respected. She hosted lavish parties that were the talk of the town. Powerful politicians, wealthy merchants, visiting dignitaries, they all came to her home. They drank her wine. They ate her food. They admired her grace and her charm. She had been married twice before. Her first husband, a high-ranking Spanish officer, died in Havana under mysterious circumstances while on his way to take up a post at court. Her second husband, a wealthy banker and lawyer, died a few years after their marriage. By the 1830s, she was married to her third husband, Dr. Leonard Louis Nicholas Lalaurie. He was much younger than her, physician. Together, they presented the perfect picture of wealth and high society. They had daughters. They were seen at the opera, at church, at all the right places. To the outside world, Delphine Lalaurie was the peak of Creole aristocracy, a woman of culture and refinement. But you lived in that house. You were one of the people she owned. And you knew the truth. You saw what happened behind the locked doors. The public saw the parties. You saw the hunger. While guests ate expensive meals in the grand dining room, the enslaved people in the house were described by neighbors as singularly haggard and worn, starved, beaten. There were rumors. People in the French Quarter whispered stories about Madame Lalaurie's quick temper, her cruelty, but they were just rumors, hard to prove. In a city where slavery was the engine of the economy, the mistreatment of enslaved people was common. It had to be extreme to get anyone's attention. And Delphine's cruelty was extreme. So extreme that it did get attention long before the final, horrible discovery. In 1833, a year before the fire, a lawyer filed a complaint. Neighbors had reported Delphine's abuse of her slaves. The case went to court. Judge Jean-François Canonge presided. He heard the evidence. He found Madame Lalaurie guilty of illegal cruelty. The law at the time was weak, but it existed. As punishment, she was forced to sell 9 of her slaves. 9 people freed from her direct control. A small victory, but it was a trick, a legal game. Delphine arranged for a relative to buy the 9 slaves at the auction. Once the paperwork was signed and the judge was satisfied, the relative secretly sold them right back to her. They returned to the house at 1140 Royal Street. Back to the beatings. Back to the starvation. The system had looked the other way. The whispers started again. but nothing changed. Then came the incident with the girl. A young girl, maybe 12 years old. Her name is recorded in some accounts as Leah or Leah. One day, a neighbor was looking out their window. They saw Madame Lalaurie chasing Leah across the second-floor balcony of the mansion. Delphine was holding a whip. The girl was terrified. She ran. She climbed onto the roof, trying to escape. Delphine followed, whip in hand. The neighbor watched as the little girl, with nowhere left to run, either slipped or jumped. She fell 3 stories into the stone courtyard below. She died instantly. This was harder to hide. A dead child in the courtyard. The authorities were called. They investigated. The official story was that it was an accident, but the rumors were too strong. Delphine was found guilty of illegal cruelty. Again, her punishment? A fine. A few $100s. Nothing for a woman of her wealth. After the officials left, the story goes, the little girl's body was taken and dropped into the well in the courtyard. Hidden away. Life in the mansion went on. The parties continued. The fine crystal was polished. And behind the scenes, the torture grew worse. Delphine Lalaurie had been challenged by the law twice. She had won. Now she felt untouchable. She believed she could do anything she wanted to the people she owned. And for almost a year, she did. It all ended on April 10th, 1834, a Thursday morning. Smoke started pouring from a window of the Lalaurie mansion. A fire had started in the kitchen. People on the street saw the smoke and ran to help. Volunteer fire companies arrived with their hand-pumped engines. They broke into the house to fight the flames. They found the source in the kitchen, and there they found the woman who started it. She was a 70-year-old enslaved cook. She was chained to the stove by her ankle. She confessed immediately. She said she set the fire on purpose. It was a suicide attempt. She told the rescuers she couldn't bear the punishment anymore. She was terrified of being taken to the room on the top floor. She said that anyone who was taken up there never came back. Her story was terrifying. The rescuers, now joined by neighbors and concerned citizens, told the Lalauries they needed to evacuate everyone from the house. That included the slaves. Dr. Lalaurie was there. He sneered at them. He told them it was none of their business. Madame Lalaurie refused to give them the keys to the slave quarters. She stood there, in the middle of the chaos, her house burning, and denied there was anyone to rescue. But the cook's story, her terror, was believable. The crowd insisted. The Lalauries refused. The law said a man's home was his castle. But this was different. The fire, the chained woman, the rumors that had circulated for years, it all came to a head in that moment. If you value documented history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. The details that follow are taken directly from newspaper accounts published in the New Orleans Bee in the days after the fire, particularly the edition from April 11th, 1834. Now back to the story. A local judge, Jean-François Canonge, the same judge from the earlier case, was on the scene. He had heard enough. He gave the order. The crowd, which was quickly becoming a mob, didn't need to be told twice. They took axes and crowbars from the fire engines. They ran up the grand staircase, past the expensive furniture and the portraits on the walls. They went to the top floor, to the attic rooms. The door to the slave quarters was locked. They smashed it open. The smell hit them first, the smell of death and infection. Then their eyes adjusted to the darkness, and they saw hell. 7 people, chained to the walls or locked in cages meant for animals. They were emaciated, their bodies covered in open sores and old wounds. They had been there for months. This was not punishment. This was systematic medical torture. One woman was wearing an iron collar lined with sharp spikes, designed so she couldn't move her head without piercing her own neck. Another man was chained in a way that had stretched his arms out of their sockets. A woman, her skin scarred from countless beatings, had her bones broken and then crudely reset at unnatural angles, so her limbs looked like a crab's. Another victim had a deep hole in their head, filled with maggots. They were still alive. The rescuers found buckets of human waste on the floor. They found implements of torture that looked like they belonged in a medieval dungeon. Whips with iron studs, paddles with nails driven through them. In the fireplace, they found what looked like human organs. It was a chamber of horrors, a private laboratory for a sadist. The rescuers, hardened men who had seen the worst of a port city, were sickened. They carried the victims out into the fresh air. Thousands of people had gathered on Royal Street. They saw the victims. They saw the chains, the starved bodies, the horrific injuries. The whispers and rumors were no longer whispers. They were the undeniable, nightmarish truth. The mob erupted. All the anger, all the suspicion from the past years, exploded in a wave of fury. The Lalories were still in the house. The mob wanted them. Delphine and her husband realized what was happening. They ran. They made their way to a carriage waiting in the courtyard. The crowd surged, trying to stop them. A witness said the carriage driver whipped the horses into a frenzy, plowing through the people who tried to block their path. The carriage careered through the streets of the French Quarter and disappeared. Madame Lalaurie had escaped, but the mob wasn't finished. They turned their rage on the house. They swarmed into the mansion at 1140 Royal Street and they destroyed everything. They were not looting. They were annihilating. They smashed the crystal chandeliers. They hacked the mahogany furniture to pieces with axes. They tore the silk curtains from the windows. They threw everything out into the street. Statues, mirrors, beds, clothing. They even tried to demolish the house itself. They tore out the windows, the doors. They ripped marble mantles from the fireplaces. They tried to tear the roof off. They worked for hours, until there was almost nothing left inside but a hollowed-out shell. The city authorities were powerless to stop them. Or perhaps they didn't want to. What happened to the victims? They were taken to the city jail, the Cabildo, to be cared for and protected. The people of New Orleans came to see them. The newspaper reported that over 4,000 people filed past them to witness for themselves the evidence of Madame Lalaurie's cruelty. 2 of the victims died within a few days. The fate of the others is not clearly recorded. They vanish from the historical record, their stories swallowed by the aftermath of the event they survived. And what of Delphine? She and her husband made it to the shores of Lake Pontchartrain, a few miles north of the city. There, they boarded a schooner that took them to the town of Covington, and from there to Mobile, Alabama. They were never seen in New Orleans again. From Mobile, they boarded a ship to France. Delphine Lalaurie, the high society hostess, the torturer, the monster of Royal Street, lived out the rest of her life in Paris. She was never arrested, never put on trial, never punished for her crimes. For years, the story in New Orleans was that she had died in a boar hunting accident in France, a fittingly violent end. But the truth was more ordinary. She died in Paris on December 7, 1849, at the age of 62. Her body was eventually returned to New Orleans and buried in secret in the city's famed St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, in a family crypt. Her grave is still there. The house at 1140 Royal Street was left as a ruined shell for years, a monument to the horror that had happened inside. People in the neighborhood claimed it was haunted. They heard screams at night. They saw strange lights in the empty windows. Eventually, it was rebuilt and sold. It passed through many owners over the next century and a half. It was a school for girls, a furniture store, a bar, an apartment building. In 2007, the actor Nicolas Cage bought it for over $3 million. He owned it for 2 years before losing it to foreclosure. The house still stands today, a beautiful, haunting landmark in the French Quarter. Tourists walk by and take pictures. Ghost tours stop outside and tell the terrifying stories. And this brings us back to the beginning, the legend, the story of orphans being fed to pigs as divine punishment on a Louisiana plantation in 1844. Where did that story come from? It is a piece of folklore, a story that grew out of the real horror of the Lalaurie mansion. Over the years, the facts became twisted and exaggerated, as they often do. The city mansion became a rural plantation. The date shifted by a decade. The enslaved victims became orphans. The meticulous, Slow, scientific torture was replaced with a single, brutal, animalistic act: feeding people to pigs. The legend is horrifying, but in a way it's a simpler, cleaner story. It gives you a monster who commits a monstrous act. It's quick. It's final. The truth is much dirtier. The truth is about torture that went on for years, not minutes. It's about a system that allowed it to happen. It's about a society that knew, that whispered, but did nothing until a fire forced them to see. The divine punishment was a lie Delphine told the world. The real punishment was what she did behind closed doors, day after day, year after year. The legend gives a monster a quick meal. The records show a society that sat down to dinner with her every night.